Ani Kenawea. Hello, everyone. Matthew Indigenous Cause. My name is Matthew, and I am a Blue Coat for Science North. And I want to welcome you, Bindiget, to our Earth Day, special Earth Day Indigenous Ingenuity Talk with Dr. Laura Lee McGregor, who I will be introducing shortly. And so, first and foremost, I want to say miigwech for joining us. And I want to first do a proper land acknowledgement. And so, first, I want to situate us and know that Science North is on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Giikendaasowin Anishinaabe, as well as the Wanapitei First Nation. And we are a part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And we also want to acknowledge the commitment to culture and economy by the Métis Nation of Ontario. And so, again, today, Nungo, it is Earth Day, so it's a really exciting day. As you can see, I'm in my beautiful backyard and got the trees starting to bloom. And we will be discussing traditional ecological knowledge and climate and environmental issues that we face today in our modern day world. So please, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Laura Lee McGregor.
Miigwech, Matt.
Good. So I'm just going to give a little kind of a little intro to you, but then at least they can put a face to the name. So Dr. Laura Lee McGregor, she is an Anishinaabe-kwe from Whitefish River First Nation on Manitoulin Island. She's an assistant professor at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine at Laurentian University here in Shkagamik-kwe in Sudbury. And this is where she teaches about Indigenous people's health. Dr. McGregor has focused her research on First Nation community health issues such as mental health and addictions, diabetes, physical activity and nutrition. And she's also worked with First Nation communities and organizations on program evaluation and strategic planning. And for the past 19 years, Dr. McGregor has been an active member of the Manitoulin Anishinaabe Research Review Committee, a community research ethics committee, and serves as chair for most of that time. So, miigwech, for joining us, Dr. McGregor. And funny enough, I know you through a little bit of this this ethics process, as I've spoken to you before about it. But please, I'd like for you to take the time to also give yourself proper introduction.
Miigwech, Matt. Ani bojo, gijipto Indishnakas, wagas kinaga ndonjaba, kwadodom, Anishinaabe endau. I'm Laura Lee McGregor. I'm from Whitefish River First Nation, and I'm really happy to be here to talk to you today about I'm going to talk about actually my family sugar bush and as it relates to Indigenous knowledge and how threats over time have impacted the practices in the sugar bush. And at one time, before I taught at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, I used to teach at the University of Sudbury in the Indigenous Studies program. I was a sessional instructor there, and I had the opportunity to teach Indigenous environmental ethics courses. And around that same time, and so while I was going to school, I used to actually be a research consultant, and I worked for a number of First Nations in Northeastern Ontario and Indigenous organizations regionally, including the Anishinaabe Nation and Chiefs of Ontario. And for the Chiefs of Ontario, I did some work in the environment area. So I am not going to say I'm an expert, but I have some experience. So I did want to frame this discussion around my family sugar bush because I think it's just a much more interesting, anyway, to me, way of learning about Indigenous knowledge, and it's through like actually really concrete examples. I wanted to tell a little bit about the sugar bush and how long I've been going to it. So I'm in my 50s, and so I've been going since I was little. And maybe Renata could put up the first slide because it. Okay, so this is. Up on the slide, it says Wagaskanaga Nindonjaba. So that means Wagaskanaga is actually the traditional name of my community, which is Whitefish River First Nation. And Nindonjaba means that's where I'm from. And the picture here is McGregor Bay. And if any of you have been to McGregor Bay, you know how beautiful McGregor Bay is. And I'm really fortunate to call McGregor Bay and Wagaskanaga home. I just wanted to give you an idea of where I'm from. And next slide, please. And so this is a picture of my daughter Sterling, and she's got my great niece Delilah up on her shoulders, and they're walking into the sugar bush. So this is kind of like the trailhead of the sugar bush. So we have like a kind of like a parking lot, and then the trail into the bush. And it's probably about a 5 to 10 minute walk in. And it's a really, really nice walk. And I really enjoy the walk because it really helps me transition from, rushing around and thinking about, work and all kinds of other stuff. And this nice short little walk, helps me transition and forget about all that boring stuff like work and think about, what's going to be happening at the sugar bush. So next slide, please. So as you get closer on the trail, you can see in the distance the sugar shack, if you will. We don't call it sugar shack, we call it sugar camp. And this particular camp, this building was built by my father and his brothers. I'm going to say in the 1980s. And we've been in this particular sugar bush for as long as I can remember. I think that we've probably been in there at least 100 years. And before we had our sugar bush out on it's called Wardrobe Island, but it's really our one of our traditional and original community sites, and it's just basically below the hill from this particular site and on an island. But for the last 100 years or so, I think we've been here in this area. And there used to be another camp right in the same area, but that building got kind of old, and so my dad and my uncles built this newish camp. It doesn't look new, but I guess the best way to describe it is it's rustic and it's functional. Yeah. So next slide, please. Let's see what I've got here. Okay, so this is my great niece Brea, and and this is a current picture. This is taken this spring. I think she's only 2 years old, and so I think this is a really interesting picture because not only is she pretty darn cute, but this is how early we start bringing our kids out to the sugar bush. I brought my kids out when they were this young as well, and as soon as they could walk, they were in the sugar bush. I think actually, in fact, I had my kids in those backpack carriers. I would take them into the sugar bush. So it's just a part of what we do in my family and who we are, and it's really important to ensure that this knowledge and these practices are sorry, so husband just got home. Hold on a moment. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it's really important to keep and carry this knowledge throughout the generations. So that's why I included this picture. Next slide, please. So we still make maple syrup the way my grandparents made maple syrup and my great grandparents made maple syrup. So actually, we have like a 3-stage process, and for some reason in this picture, the third pot isn't shown in the picture. I don't know where it is, what happened that day. But anyway, so it's a 3-stage process, and you can see the pot that's on the far right. That's kind of like the finishing pot, and that's the one that is watched quite closely towards the end of the day. Um, it's a really interesting process, and I have to say that, you know, I'm not an expert at by any means on making maple syrup. I'm kind of like I don't know. I guess I consider myself just one of the soldiers or one of the grunts as part of the camp. Nobody leaves me in charge of anything important. I do try and spend as much time as I can in the sugar bush, but my main role, I would say, is collecting sap and yeah, bringing treats into to the camp that and everybody brings in like really good stuff to eat too. Um, so next, let's see what the next picture is. I can't remember what I put up here. Okay, um, so running a sugar bush is a really big operation. It requires an intense amount of labor for a short period of time. So you need wood. Um, you need wood for the fire, and you need someone to watch that fire too. So in this picture, it's a picture of my father who's since passed away, and my nephew Max when he was probably about 3 years old. And so you can see that he was, um, you know, um, you know how little kids like to help out, right? So um, he's, you know, helping pile wood. Probably there's a trailer behind the quad, and he's helping to stack the wood. So I think it's really important, you know, to start kids doing, you know, simple things even at a young age. Like he's probably 3 or 4, I'm going to guess, in the picture. And you can see my dad patiently waiting for him to stack the wood. And um, I'd have to say, like, my dad was really, really patient, you know, with me and my siblings, and also my, you know, my kids and my nieces and nephews, and um, quietly teaching us how to do things and help out. Right, it was helping out is really, really important. Um, so um, I think some of the things that the sugar bush has taught me and my family and my kids for sure is things like preparation, because it's, you know, it's not just the time that you're in the bush making the syrup. It's actually, you know, the weeks leading up to it. Can you hold on a home? Sorry, I'm not sure if it's picking up the background noise. So, you know, things start like weeks ahead. Um, you know, getting the pots ready, getting, you know, making a trail up into the bush. So, you know, we start looking at going into the bush in late February, early March, and there's still quite a bit of snow in the bush. So I know that this year, for example, my son, he was he actually shoveled quite a few trails into the sugar bush so that we would have access to the trees when we're hauling. It teaches patience. So you can see in this picture my dad patiently waiting for the little guy to stack the wood. And some of it is really hard work. Like it's like physically demanding work. Um, yeah, so I think it teaches really, really good values. Someone's messaging me and teasing me, so I'm just going to ignore that. Next slide, please. So even though it's a lot of hard work, there's also a lot of fun involved. And so here's a picture of my son there, and this is when he was a teenager, and he's make cooking himself a hot dog over the fire, um, and that's, you know, one of the fun parts that I always looked forward to when I was a kid was, you know, we would oftentimes, the bus would drop us off by the entrance to the sugar bush, and we would walk in, and we would go in and root around and look and see if there's any hot dogs, and we'd make ourselves a hot dog and sit around and chat. And then there was, I don't know, some kind of unspoken signal, and we would go outside and start hauling sap. So it was just a lot of fun. And the sitting around and chatting, like, and eating, and chatting and eating, is a really important part for connecting to each other. And also, it's not just like, I guess, a nuclear family or process, right? It involves extended family. So I mentioned earlier that my uncles were, obviously integral parts of the sugar bush, but so also my cousins, right? So, and now that we're all adults, it's a really great time to catch up with our cousins and find out what's happening, and just sit around and shoot the breeze. It's quite a bit of fun. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of my father, and he's staring up at the trees. And this is just such a classic picture of my dad. And I included this picture because one of the really interesting things about the sugar bush is, and I'm just learning this too, is that um, there's a lot of, when there's a decision to be made, it requires quite a bit of discussion and deliberation. And my brother Steve was telling me about this. When he was younger, and he would hear my dad and my uncles talking about, maybe a tree had died and it was time for it to be, maybe it should be cut down and made into firewood. And so he was like all young and gung ho, and he's like, okay, like, it's time to cut this tree down, right? And but they wouldn't do it right away. They would talk about it some more. And he was impatient. He wanted it to happen, and it just wasn't happening, like, really quickly. And what came to realize was that the deliberations in deciding whether to cut a tree down considered not just, that the wood would be used for firewood, but there was quite a bit of consideration for the, essentially what the tree is like, an, an ecosystem, right? There's other living creatures that rely on that tree. So cutting down a tree was not taken lightly, because it would have repercussions and impacts. So I think that's a really important lesson to learn, is that, we just think, yeah, that tree's in the way, let's get it down and let's cut it up and we'll have, firewood. You know, it's not just us who want that tree, and it's actually animals, insects, birds who need that tree too. So I think that's a really interesting part of the sugar bush. Um, And I just want to talk a little bit about last year. Of course, we're still in this pandemic, and the pandemic had a big impact on our sugar bush, particularly last year. Last year, my brothers, um, I keep talking about my brothers. I have five brothers and three sisters. And so last March, two of my brothers had been in Toronto just around when the pandemic, came to be really of concern. And so they had to quarantine, self quarantine. They weren't allowed to be out and about. So they weren't allowed to go out into the sugar bush for, 2 weeks. And my brother Murray and my brother Steve, they're, along with my brothers Derek and Bill, important parts of, running the sugar bush. So um, they weren't able to help out and, do the work that they would normally do. And my son and my nephews, who were in going to school in Toronto, they're in post secondary. They weren't able to come up either, right? So it was a skeleton crew out in the bush, and I was really proud of my sister Lisa for really stepping up and, you know, kind of taking a lead role. And like she would go out into the and she'd be in the bush at like 6:30 in the morning starting the fire. I think I went out with her once. But she was like, you know, she was in there making sure that the camp was still running. And so it was a really unique time. And I think that you know, spending so much time, I guess if push came to shove, I could probably manage the sugar bush a little bit, but I wouldn't leave me in charge if I had the choice. So I just wanted to lead off with that, talk a little bit about the sugar bush. And I did want to also talk about some of the threats to the sugar bush. And I guess that's kind of the end of the slide. So it's just my face now, which is not the kind of a little bit distracting, but you can always look at my Christy Belcourt picture in the background. um, so one of the bigger threats to the sugar bush was actually the acid rain. So those of you who are boomers or Gen X, you'll recall that, you know, acid rain was a really huge issue in the 70s and 1980s. And so we know that, you know, sulfur dioxide from smelters were floating up into the atmosphere and causing acid rain, which um, had a number of impacts, including, you know, killing lakes and making the soil quite acidic. And so my community, which has several names, and one of them is Birch Island, and quite a few of the birch trees died off because of that. Um, yeah, so, and particularly, you know, after 1972, when, you know, the super stack was built here in Sudbury. And I just want to tell a little story. One time I was driving through Coppercliff, and my daughter was quite young then. She was about 3 years old. And she sees the super stack, and she says to me, "Mom, what is that?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's the super stack." I said, it sends pollution to faraway places. And she kind of, I could hear her kind of muttering under her breath. She's like, "Super stack? More like stupid stack." So she just cracked me up anyway. So I find it interesting how perceptive young people, the young children are. So that was my little super stack story. But anyway, so the birch trees are particularly, you know, sensitive to acidic soil, and many trees died. And I would say there's still long-term impacts. So, you know, I was chatting with my brother Murray about this the other night, and he's like, you know, there are birch trees again, but they don't grow past a certain size. They just die off. So we don't have like although birch trees can get quite, you know, the diameter can get quite big. They don't get that big anymore. They die before they get to that size. So, and I think like, well, you know, the maples survived that, but I think if you think about forest ecosystems and, you know, the interactions among, you know, the different tree species, you know, losing or having a species like birch impacted, you know, really diminishes the biodiversity in the forest. And I actually just got this book today. Because I think it's really interesting. It's called the Hidden Life of Trees, and it's what they feel, how they communicate. So, you know, the trees are much more complex than we're give them credit for. I think, you know, sometimes we look at trees and think, oh, firewood, or oh, that's pretty. Look at the pretty maple leaves in the fall. But you know, the complex world of trees is we really don't really know too much about. Um, Another threat to, I guess, sugar bush and forest ecosystems is invasive species. And um, one most recently that I can think of is it's called the European gypsy moth. So everyone's quite familiar with the tent caterpillars, and those tent caterpillars are indigenous to North America, but obviously the European gypsy moth is not. And I remember a few years back when they first started invading, and like just the devastation they wreaked upon the trees. They ate everything and all the leaves in sight. And I remember it was, late spring, early summer, and the trees were bare, and it looked pretty desolate for a while. And so that was, and then they came back the next year, and I think it was too much for the trees, and some of them, particularly the oaks, didn't survive. And so up behind my parents' place, there's kind of like a forest, and you can kind of see bare patches where the oak trees have died. So I think I don't think they got into the sugar bush too much. But I mean, they're going to come back, right? They're 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 a species that's going to come back. Um, Probably the biggest threat, though, to the sugar bush at this time is global warming. Um, the the sugar making maple syrup sugar season has changed a lot. So I remember that we used to go into the sugar bush around maybe after March break and into April. We were done this year by Easter. That was like it was done. And so I think we have to go and think about going into the sugar bush, in um, mid-February. And it's of concern because of the warming temperatures. That's a trend, of course. And then if there's the erratic temperature changes, so sometimes in the winter you might have like a warm spell, which is kind of at one time would have been unheard of. And one of the impacts of that is that you don't have um, the ground doesn't freeze as deeply anymore. So at one time the frost would go as deep as like say 4 feet. It doesn't do that anymore. The frost is only 1 to 2 feet, and frost is really important um, for making sap. So yeah, this warming trend is not good. It does not bode well for the maple sugar bush. And I was chatting with my brother Murray about this the other night, and he's like, maybe probably within 50 years, it's just going to be too warm. It's not going to be cold enough for the sap to run, and that to me is a big concern. So on that cheerful note, I'm going to end my talk and or my presentation portion of the talk. And I'm not sure if Matt's going to ask me any questions, or if there's any questions from the thousands of people who are watching this.
Well, I mean, I think that's what we're going to get into. So first and foremost, miigwech for sharing your story and that of your family spending time out at the sugar bush and the sugar camp, and just like enjoying each other and enjoying your home. And I think that's so important, especially nowadays, right? With COVID, we've been so disconnected. Cherishing those moments is the thing. So we will go into some questions from our audience, but I'd like to just kick it off with, well, one, I want to acknowledge and say and say thank you to your family, your father and your brothers Steve, Derek, and Murray, because they saved me one time going hunting with them many years ago on another project that we were doing, and I got lost in the bush while hunting, and so.
Oh, you're that Matt. Okay.
Yes, I'm the Matt's Landing, and that's so. So yeah, so I want to thank them because they didn't leave me. They didn't leave me behind. Um, but that's one thing though, and I think from that experience and from what you're talking about here is what I'd like to maybe touch upon is how and I noticed with your family and just through your stories and going out with them is that how connected they are and continue to be to the place that you live, and to have that like intimate relationship with the environment around you has given you, seems like it's obviously given you so much perspective on even now current and global issues that are happening. But can you like kind of elaborate more on like maybe the importance of humanity, of like reconnecting with their place in space and their place that they call home?
Yeah, so we're really fortunate to grow up in our community, and in my family, there was always the practices of the hunting. I used to go hunting too, and until anyway, I can't tell that story, but um, so it's funny. Like my dad would always. My mom loves traveling, but my dad would all. He didn't really care to travel. He just preferred to be at home in Birch Island, and that was, his feet were firmly planted there, and that's where he wanted to be. He spent a lot of time in the bush, and that's what he taught to my brothers and my sisters too, right? And I think maybe also too because we're such a large family. So he came from a large family. He was the youngest of like 12 kids, and I'm the seventh of 10 kids. So um, we as a family, I guess, spend a lot of time. We spent a lot of time growing up, and we still do actually. We still somebody said it funnily, like we're in each other's pockets, kind of thing. But that is just so important to um, not only connect to each other but also to the land. And doing, I think, is the best way to to connect. Like, so you're actually doing and interacting with the environment. And the story I told about my brother wanting to cut down the tree right away, and my dad and my uncles are like, no, no, we got to talk about this, right? We got to think long term. And that's one of the things um, they say, or that's really important in Anishinaabe perspectives, is thinking about the future generations, right? You think about others, you think about the future generations, so anything you do is going to have an impact, right? um, I think I'm kind of babbling here, so I'm just gonna stop.
No, no, that's no, what you've been saying, that's really great, and I think it kind of it prompts that conversation in like in my head, and hopefully for others, is you know thinking of that long-term process, and that we may look at that one tree as standing and it may have been fallen and is now dead, but how it plays into that greater life cycle and energy cycle that we see then those decomposers and different insects that start to inhabit these trees that seem to us that it's like, oh well, that might not be good anymore, we can just discard of it. um, and at the end of like your kind of your first kind of like slide talk, you mentioned and how you and your brother were talking on how the ability to harvest maple syrup and the sap, not to harvest the maple syrup but to harvest the sap, in 50 years time, could that be something that we are no longer able to do? Like you know what kind of perspectives can you provide us in like how things have changed, or how you've made noticed things change over time through your life, on just things like harvesting food off the land, be it from fishing to hunting to collecting. Like, it seems as though these systems are being greatly impacted.
Yeah, at one time, I mean, one of the ways that we would fish is through the long nets, right? And like you could set a net, and then in the evening and the next morning it would be full of fish. But it's not like that anymore. You have to go to different places and you're not going to get the same amount of fish. So there's definitely fewer fish in the water. Some of that is due to over harvesting. Some of it is due to the introduction of, species like salmon, right, which are not indigenous to the Great Lakes. So those kind of fish kind of outcompete the indigenous fish, right, for food and habitat. So that's one of the changes. At one time, there was hardly any fish. When I was quite young, there was lots of snakes and frogs in the water. There was quite a bit of biodiversity, and for a while there was hardly any. There was hardly any fish. You would hardly see any snakes. Some people are scared of snakes, but in my family, we're not. You can't scare us with a snake. um, uh, but I would say they're slowly coming back. They're very slowly coming back. I'm not sure if that was due to pesticides. And that's actually one of the, there's an elders group that's been really fighting against the spraying of herbicides along the transmission lines, right? So um, anytime you make a change to the environment, it's going to have impacts, right? Um, and so I would say that's one of the impacts is the loss of biodiversity. Um, what else? Um, Small game. I think that's another thing that people have noticed is that there's, at one time, I didn't do this, but I think my older siblings got to do this. But they would snare rabbits. There would be enough rabbits that you could snare, but there's just not as many anymore. So small game like that. There's certainly a lot of deer on Manitoulin, you know that. um, you hit them every couple of with your vehicles all the time. There's certainly a lot of deer, and I think moose are making a comeback. I have a pretty funny moose story, but I don't know if my brother would appreciate me telling that one. So
No, not on live air. No.
not live, maybe.
No, and I think that that comeback is I guess it just really demonstrates the resiliency of our ecosystems. But I think there's also, and as you're mentioning, like there's that, whenever we make a change to the environment, there's always going to be a repercussion. There's always going to be, or at least an impact on it in some way.
Hmm.
And mentioning the stupid stack, that was really funny. But the super stack, but and spending time out towards Birch Island, and I'm sure maybe some of our listeners had spent time even in what's now part of the Killarney Provincial Park. But I recall, like I love going canoeing out that way, and like going into Nelly Lake, where it's completely vacant of life. Like you go and you could see 30, 40 feet down, if not more, into the body of water. Um, what are your hopes to see, like, coming as things are changing, people are becoming more aware of our impact, especially the youth, like with all of those youth climate strikes that have been going on globally, and obviously your connection with Indigenous knowledge systems, and how Indigenous people have been advocating for better life way. What are your thoughts on the future? Like, what do you think that the next 100 years are going to look like?
Well, I think if one thing that the pandemic has taught us is that that we should slow down, right? And it's really forced us to slow down and spend time at home and really appreciate our local environment, right? So like I think we were chatting about this a few days ago, but you know, um, I'd never been to the crack, the Killarney crack. I hiked that last fall, although it was quite crowded there. So the Killarney Park is the traditional territory of part of the traditional territory of Whitefish River First Nation, and unfortunately, we kind of signed our rights away to that park, that area, that territory, and when this went to a vote in my community, I'm like, money comes and goes, but land is forever. Like you never give up, you never give up land, right? It's our future, and that's where our future is. I think sometimes some older generations um, don't really maybe don't see the long-term impacts, but I would say our youth are so smart, and I have a lot of respect for the youth. They have like so energetic, amazing ideas. Like some of the youth in the community of in my community are just really really amazing. There's a really really great bunch of kids there who um, you know, they're not afraid to speak out, which is great. So I have a lot of hope for the future, and I'm laying it all on the youth, man. Yeah,
All that pressure's on the youth. No,
yeah,
don't
yeah.
worry about it. Yeah.
They don't have enough anxiety.
No,
I'm
no.
just gonna lay that. You must fix the future. You must fix the environment that we wrecked.
But but it is a good point. But and it shows though that, as we only spend so much time here on this earth, and to have that perspective and ability to reflect on what we do today will impact those tomorrow, and not only our immediate children, but generations to come, is important. And I think that, like you said, that there are many who have really um, listened to the call, and are following that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a little bit about that. So
Mhm.
sometimes, and you've probably heard this, Matt, like this idea of seven generations. And so there's a couple of ways to look at it, but like, your children, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren. But the one I like is in the different seven generations teaching, where like you yourself are in the middle, and the three generations behind you. So your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents. So you think about what they've done and the teachings that they've given to you. And then you think about the three generations ahead of you. So your children, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, right? So I think sometimes if we try to think like seven generations ahead is too abstract, but if you put yourself kind of like in the middle, and you can see, like, I mean, I knew my great grandparents, right? I probably won't know my great grandchildren because I had my kids kind of like in my 30s. So anyway, but that's it's less abstract to think of the seven generations that way, so that those impacts can be probably seen in those lifetimes, right? Anyway, I
Uh,
digress.
no, that's so true, and I appreciate that, because I have heard of that teaching previously, and how I've come across it is that, like, thinking even seven generations ahead, but to center yourself, to keep, like, and I think, like you're saying, to keep it less abstract, and maybe that's a really kind of beautiful way of looking at that teaching, and so that's great. I don't, what, I feel bad. I'm kind of neglecting. Am I neglecting our audience? Um, I know that that Renata had a question of just like, you know, her question says, how long does it take for a maple tree to grow to the point where it produces enough sap? And so, is there like kind of a, even just a visual, that like a diameter that you look for, or
Gee, I'm not the expert in that. I'm gonna say, like, I don't see trees. um I don't know. I don't even know the age of them. Oh my god, I'm not the expert here.
no? That's okay.
They're like at least this big, like at least. So some of them, a tree that size might only have one pale on them, but once they get to like, I don't know, I'm just going to measure out here. They might have three pales on them. So
Oh, so
I don't know the age of them. They got to be at least, I'm going to guess 40, 50 years.
wow.
They're Yeah, they're slow growing, right? I mean, we're Northern Ontario, so it's not a fast growing species.
And having multiple, so I didn't see, I don't think I've ever seen that, like, the multiple pales on, if the tree can sustain it, then that's pretty cool.
Hmm.
um I guess it's probably a feel thing, like you kind of just have an intuition as to what tree you're going to use, like you're going out and picking the tree, and I'm sure that comes with experience.
Yeah, my that would be one of my brother questions. You should have invited them
The whole family
next
could have
year.
jumped on. Whole family. We
Next
have
year.
we have room on our streaming service. um, so we have a question too. So a comment and question from Chantal, and so she writes that, I love that your family still uses traditional ways of boiling sap. this year didn't seem to have that stretch of cold nights and warm days needed for flowing sap. And so she's asked, like, do you see a day when the sap doesn't run?
Yeah, I was pretty concerned this year because I had initially planned to go out in like spend the month of March in Birch Island, and then anyway, I didn't get out there till I think mid-March, and like that first week I was in the sugar bush. Yeah, it was not running very good. I was worried because we didn't hardly have enough to boil. So yeah, I do see that day coming, unfortunately.
And so, and I guess, and so, and it takes because it takes that those specific conditions for it to happen. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm trying to think on.
There has to be like it runs best if there's like a frost overnight,
Mhm.
and then has to be, um, obviously above zero for the sap to run. And actually, the wind also impacts
Mm.
how fast the sap will run. Yeah.
Wow, yeah, that makes sense, and I would say that sorry, and so, someone's comment here says I would say at least a 10-inch diameter to tap a maple tree, which that seems probably what you're thinking, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so one of these, as these things kind of are happening, like, and I know you're talking again, you're talking to your brother not long ago about things, and it's like, what kind of conversations are you having, and like, is your community having, and people around you who also go out and to their sugar bush, like, what kind of, I guess, what I'm trying to say here, what kind of perspectives and what kind of emotions are had as things are changing, and it's like, oh, we didn't get a chance to harvest as much this year.
Um, yeah, I think it's worrisome. I don't, I think while we're in the thick of it, it's a pretty fun and happy kind of time. But I think, I don't know. I don't know. We don't haven't really chatted with the other families who have sugar bushes in Birch Island. There's several. There's at least 4 or 5 others in the community. Um, but one of the things that we started doing in the sugar bush is we have a log. We call it Captain's Log. And record the conditions of the day and how the sap is running, and people put in their funny, like, people are pretty funny. I'm not one of the funny ones, but there's pretty funny entries. And my brother Murray said he started doing that because he wanted to kind of like be able to look at, you know the changing conditions over time and having some kind of record of it. So it's not just a fun thing, but it's also like a record over time of how the environment and temperature is changing.
That's well, one, I love the captain's log. That's really funny. But and but that's amazing for him to and for the family to participate in something like that, because it seems as though, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I do feel as though there's a disconnect at times with what most people would consider science, and they're like, and how we research things. But to me, what your family is doing and sitting there and recording all of those things is exactly that type of intimate relationship that's needed to understand those minute changes in the environment, to then fully understand what's happening around us. And what do you have any thoughts on uh, in like kind of indigenous perspectives and knowledge, in comparison to Western knowledge, and how we value them?
Well, I would say there's definitely similarities in some ways. So, this idea of observation, that's an important part of Western science too, right? Observation. And I think, though, that, for Indigenous knowledge, that observation, it's not just like an experiment in a lab and you're observing you know, the poor mouse or whatever it is you're experimenting on, but it's like the observation is for like generations, honestly. So, and how that knowledge is shared is generally orally, but now, I just told you about the captain's log, so it's also being written. um, so that's one way that knowledge is shared or generated and shared. So you're learning about it through observation. There's also, I would say experimentation. So like, you know, trying different ways or methods is, kind of like Western science, right? That's certainly an aspect of Western science. I think the biggest difference though between like Western science and Indigenous knowledge is that there's a spiritual aspect to Indigenous knowledge, and some of the, there's definitely stories about how we knew to how we knew there was going to be sap and how to make the syrup, right? So there's stories about that, and um, now that the snow's off the ground, you can't really tell those stories. And I'm not really a good storyteller about that anyway. So those kind of stories are, they call them adzokan. Um, but, so there's definitely a spiritual aspect that, this a belief that, these things were gifts from the creator, right? It's not just like, oh, happenstance, somebody accidentally nicked a maple tree and suddenly there's sap, and hey, the sap is sweet, right? They're, those kind of things are considered gifts from the creator, and that, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I would say the spiritual aspect is different. And when you talk spiritual aspects to knowledge, like Western trained scientists are going to look at you like you're crazy. But that's okay. Like, they can believe what they want to believe, and we'll believe what we believe.
Well, that's it. And I think that, and in many ways, I have to say that there's many times where Western science is, all we're doing is catching up to Indigenous ways of knowing. And so maybe one day we'll figure out how to quantify spirituality. I hope not.
Yeah.
I'm just
I
teasing you.
don't think that's a great idea, but
That's not a
anyway,
good idea
sure.
at all. So, I mean, we're coming close to an end to our talk, but I think that the last thing, because it is, every day should be Earth Day, but today it is Earth Day, and I'd love to hear something a little bit about how you can tie in teachings from the Earth and Shkagamik-kwe, but like how you approach your teaching position at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. And I know that you're focusing on Indigenous people's health in many different aspects. And how does that tie into the health of the land and just being on the land?
Well, I would say that the health of the land and the health of the people are intimately related. You can't be healthy if the land is not healthy, right? So, traditionally we would, be able to harvest medicines and food from the land, and those have all been impacted in a number of ways. So I think that um, we need to, um, I think one of the biggest lessons, I think that's a really hard lesson. It's certainly a hard lesson for me is, sometimes there's this, you've probably heard of this concept of reciprocity. And, in, and I guess in its simplest form, you think like, oh, well, if I'm going to um, pick a plant for medicine, and then I offer tobacco, right? So you're giving tobacco if you're going to take a plant. And that's kind of like it's reciprocity in its simplest form, but it's actually more than that. It's more than a mere transaction, right? Um, I think the hardest lesson is that, and I heard this. I think it was Leroy Littlebear who talked about this. He's a Blackfoot scholar, and he was talking about, we should always be thinking about what we can give. It's not like, oh, well, I gave tobacco, therefore I can take this. It's like, what can we give? How can we help? Right? How can we help heal um, Shkagamik-kwe, which is, a word for Mother Earth. And so there's different ways you can do that. So one example I can think of that you probably have heard of is the water walks. And what the water walk is really about is praying for the water to heal. We know the water has, taken a lot of, has been polluted in many different ways. So that's what mainly those water walks were about. Was not only raising awareness, but it was actually like when you're walking, you're supposed to be praying and praying for that water, right? So I think um, I think the hardest lesson is that we really need to think about how can we give back to the land? How can we help heal it?
Well, that's truly appreciated, and I appreciate you. I appreciate you mentioning actually and coming to an end with the water walks, because it is something that people will be able to hopefully participate in. I think that there's one coming up with Dr. Tasha Beads around Junction Creek area, and will continue for months that she's going to do. But again, recognizing the hard work that Elder Josephine Mandeman contributed, and now Autumn Peltier and so on, and it's really inspiring to see these strong people, these strong women coming out and speaking for the land and for the water. And so thank you for sharing all of your stories and perspectives on this, and it's been such a pleasure for you to join us in this Indigenous Ingenuity Talks, and on this special day.
Well, I
Is there
hope
anything?
next year we don't have to physical distance and you can come out to the sugar bush, Matt, and you won't get lost. It's not too
Good.
far in the bush.
I know. Well, there'll be a shoveled path, right? So they're like, at least I'll.
Or maybe you could go shovel the path. No.
I can shovel the path. Yeah, yeah. That's like my. Yeah. You got to work for what you get. So I'd
Yeah.
love to try some of your maple syrup. Well, is there anything you'd like to close with?
No, I just uh, thank you for the opportunity. You know, I got a busy life as a professor and all kind of stuff obviously happening at Laurentian and Awesome, but this really, gave me something, the opportunity to talk about something that I really love, which is my family sugar bush.
I'll Chimiquich, Dr. McGregor, and we look forward to seeing you some more soon.
Mm-hmm. Ahau.
Mahalo,
Bamapi.
Bama. Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.